When he crossed through the Asinarian Gate on December 17th, 546, Totila believed that he was the master of Italy. He controlled most of the strongholds on the peninsula, the Roman army was in disarray, and Belisarius was down for the count. What Totila didn't know was that Justinian's men still had fight left in them. Keeping Italy would not be a walk in the park. Meanwhile, for the Romans, a major change was on the horizon. They didn't know it, but an era was coming to an end. After taking Rome, Totila sent Pelagius to Constantinople with a message for Justinian. As to what has transpired in the city of Rome, since I suppose thou hast learned everything, I have decided to remain silent. But as to the purpose for which I have sent these envoys, thou shalt straightway be informed. We demand that thou, for thy part, take to thyself the advantages which flow from peace, and also grant them to us. And if this same condition should perchance please thee, thou wouldst properly be called my father, and thou wilt also have us, hereafter, as allies, against whomsoever thou mayest wish to use us. While this message had overtures of peace and friendship, it was not full of innocence. Totila instructed his envoys to make sure that Justinian took the peace offer, because if he didn't, Rome would be razed, the Roman senators would be killed, and the Ostrogoths would invade Illyricum. Those were serious threats, but Justinian did not flinch. He dismissed the envoys, not giving them much consideration, and informed them that Belisarius, and Belisarius alone, was empowered to make peace in Italy. Meanwhile, though, Belisarius was quiet. This was partially because it was winter, partially because he was still recovering from his illness, and partially because the Roman army simply did not have the numbers to mount a serious offensive against Totila. In the south, though, a wealthy landowner named Tullianus was busy raising an army of peasant farmers and agreed to ally with John and his men in Hydruntum. Tullianus's men blocked key roads into the region, partially cutting southern Italy off from the north. This makeshift militia won a minor skirmish against the Ostrogoths, prompting Totila to march south with his full army and abandon the city of Rome. He did this for a few reasons. He wanted to keep the pressure on any remaining Roman army in the field and eliminate any threat before it became a problem. And Belisarius was still in a bad way. He had a very small force at his disposal, and they were demoralized. So Totila could leave a small force of his own outside Portus, and he assumed that this would be enough to keep the Romans at bay. Also, though, Rome was pretty much worthless. The citizens had abandoned their homes, the senators were Totila's prisoners, and the city's wealth had been completely stripped away. Furthermore, Totila's men had destroyed about 1/3 of the city's walls, which meant that it would be very difficult and costly to reoccupy and defend. Belisarius needed defensive positions for his small army. Rome did not offer that. so the city was strategically, economically, and politically useless. For Totila, it was a trophy more than anything, and something he didn't think that he risked losing. A big factor, though, was that he still had the senators, and that was more valuable than the city itself. Totila planned to use them as bargaining chips with Justinian if he rejected the peace offer. So as long as they were his prisoners, he had the real prize. And so Totila marched south, taking his new captives with him. John pulled the bulk of his army back into Hydruntum, leaving mostly the peasant militia to stand up to the main Ostrogothic army, with only limited reinforcements. As Totila approached, he realized what he was up against and sent messengers who promised the peasant farmers that, if they laid down their arms, he would seize the fields from the wealthy landowners and transfer ownership to the men who actually worked the land. Land reform. Score one for the Totila was a man of the people argument. But again, this was strategic and not any real commitment to the common man. Totila probably even hoped that the farmers would join his ranks when he made this offer. And while the peasantry didn't go that far, they did in fact lay down their arms. Tullianus' militia fell apart overnight. Totila had quickly and easily squashed another threat. Now determined to finish off the Romans entirely, he left the captive senators in Capua, guarded by a small garrison, and hurried north intent on taking Ravenna. While en route, though, he got some surprising news. As it turns out, Belisarius didn't hear no bell. With Totila away from Rome, Belisarius had escaped from Portus, outmaneuvered the Ostrogoths meant to guard him, and reoccupied the Eternal City. Seeing the walls in shambles, he had his men reconstruct them piece by piece. They stacked stones, bricks, rubble, whatever they could find, in whatever order they could find it, to rebuild the walls. The only condition? That the outside of the walls appeared smooth and complete, so that the Ostrogoths wouldn't be able to identify the weak points. This wasn't a great feat of engineering like Rome is famous for. They simply did not have time for that. But it was one hell of a deception, and the illusion was all that Belisarius needed. Totila realized that he had miscalculated and veered away from Ravenna, moving back towards the city that he had just broken. With the walls repaired, the options for attacking the city were limited. But Belisarius had only been able to repair the walls and not the damaged gates. And that's where Totila's men would concentrate their attacks. But attacking at the gates created a bottleneck, and this lessened the Ostrogothic numerical advantage. Also, the Romans were able to fire projectiles from atop the city's walls. The Ostrogoths launched a few different attacks over a few different days, but were unable to breach the defenses. And Belisarius, unlike Bessus, ordered and led sorties of his own out against the Ostrogothic lines, which demoralized the enemy. The Ostrogoths had just taken this city after a year-long siege, but Totila had not completely destroyed the walls, had left the city standing, and didn't even defend it with a garrison, and now they had to fight for it again? Psychologically, that was a big blow. Totila decided against another siege, and instead destroyed the bridges along the Tiber, hoping to trap Belisarius and limit his movements. Totila then retreated his army to Tiber, giving Belisarius the time he needed to repair the gates around Rome. When work was complete, he sent the keys to Emperor Justinian in Constantinople. Rome, even in its dilapidated state, was once again in the hands of a Roman emperor. And slowly but surely, people started to move back. Meanwhile, in the south, John had reactivated his men and marched at full speed towards Campania. He encountered an Ostrogothic force and fought a fierce battle outside Capua, emerging victorious. The cavalry that was supposed to defend Capua retreated and joined Totila, telling him that John's army was huge, that he must have received some new reinforcements. This wasn't true, though. They were just trying to save face in front of the king by telling him that the army was bigger than it was. After the Ostrogoths fled, John was able to enter Capua and liberate the captured senators with their families, who were then escorted to Sicily. When Totila got the news, he was furious. John and Belisarius, who weren't even working together, had combined to make him look like a fool. Belisarius took his trophy, and John stole his bargaining chips. Why wouldn't these guys just quit? Enraged, Totila set his sights on John and determined to crush him. When he caught up to him, though, he made another critical mistake. Totila had the larger army, but instead of surrounding his opponent or trying to cut off his escape, he instead launched an immediate strike. Additionally, this happened at nightfall, which meant that everyone had limited visibility. John's army wasn't prepared for battle and retreated into the darkness, while the Ostrogoths fell into disarray. With the confusion and the darkness, Totila couldn't track the Romans as they escaped, and they only suffered around 100 casualties. The rest were able to retreat back to Hydruntum. The Ostrogoths were able to raid the hastily abandoned camp, but didn't really accomplish much else. The year 547, as a whole, was a major failure for Totila. He had lost Rome without really putting up a fight, lost the senators who he had taken as prisoner, and let John's army slip away. He had let the Roman army off the hook. Back in Constantinople, Justinian was finally able to send more men to Italy. Still not enough to equal Totila's numbers, but Belisarius would take all the men he could get. He was ordered by the emperor to rendezvous with his reinforcements in southern Italy, so he gathered about 1,800 men and sailed south, leaving a subordinate officer, Conon, in charge of the remaining garrison in Rome. Moving across land was still not really an option. Belisarius didn't have the men to take on Totila in open battle, so he had to avoid the enemy at all costs. He sailed for Tarentum, but got caught up in a storm and had to land at Crotone, which was very poorly fortified. While his infantry made camp in town, he ordered his cavalry to move ahead, scout the area, and secure the roads. The cavalry encountered and defeated an Ostrogothic army and began to set up their camp. Totila learned of the cavalry's location and came after them with a larger force, routing them. Since he didn't have reasonable fortifications, Belisarius was forced to retreat back to sea, and he sailed for Sicily. Totila then turned his army on Roscianum and initiated a siege. Belisarius attempted to return by sea, but was unable to land, and instead made his way to Hydruntum to meet with John and the rest of the imperial army. Back in Rome, the garrison was unhappy, and the reason is a problem that just keeps coming up. Their pay was late, as it always was. Without Belisarius there to calm their nerves, they rose up in mutiny against Conon and killed him. The garrison, realizing that this could get them in some trouble, sent priests to Constantinople to meet with Justinian and demand the back pay that they were owed, threatening to turn the city over to Totila if it didn't arrive. Justinian at the time was dealing with his own problems, and we'll get to that in just a minute. He sent the priests back to Rome with the promised salary. Back at Hydruntum, the Roman command met to discuss tactics, and Belisarius sent Antonina back to Constantinople, hoping that she would be able to meet with Theodora. Belisarius's pleas for help in Italy had not resulted in significant support, and he hoped that Antonina would be able to convince the Empress, who was often a close ally of hers, that Italy needed more men and more money. If the Empress bought into the cause, she could then pressure the Emperor to give Belisarius the tools he needed to do the job. Belisarius felt that the campaign in Italy depended on Antonina's ability to sway Theodora. In the meantime, the Roman command, realizing that they could not relieve Roscianum through force, played for tricks. Belisarius sailed back to Rome with supplies for the city. John and Valerian, who had arrived with the new reinforcements, would move north. The hope was that Totila would break off the siege and attempt to follow at least one, or perhaps all of these generals away from Roscianum. But Totila didn't take the bait. The city was on the brink of surrender, and Totila wasn't about to let this one get away. With no relief coming, the city surrendered, and Totila gained control of a significant port in southern Italy. But that was not the big story of 548, because while Belisarius was sailing back to Rome, Antonina was arriving in Constantinople and ready to meet her patron, her friend, the Empress Theodora. When Antonina reached the capital, the news was rushed to her. She would have heard the moment she stepped off the boat. The whole city already knew. Empress Theodora had died. One ancient source lists the cause of death as cancer. Justinian had spent the last several weeks at her bedside, tending to her needs as she was weakened by the day. He would have been dealing with this, the death of his partner, the love of his life, when the priests from Rome arrived to discuss the mutiny against Conan. These squabbles likely didn't matter to Justinian at the time. He would have paid them off just to shut them up at that moment. Antonina, on the other hand, probably didn't know what to make of this. Theodora was her friend, but at times she was her rival. But she was also her political ally, the reason Belisarius had sent her back in the first place. But none of that mattered now. She was gone. It was no longer Justinian and Theodora. It was only Justinian. Antonina could not ask the Emperor for more support under these conditions. But what else could she do? Leave her husband in the field, fighting a hopeless campaign with limited resources? She only had one option. She asked Justinian to recall Belisarius, and the Emperor obliged. Belisarius would sail home from Italy in late 548 or possibly early 549. And he would never return. Nor would he ever return to Africa, or to the east. Aside from one more battle, a swan song in 559, he would never lead another army in the field. This, effectively, is the end of Belisarius' military career. I don't think that this will come as a surprise to anyone who has been following along with this series, but I'm a Belisarius guy, and it makes me a little sad that we don't have future campaigns to look forward to. It's also a little sad that his distinguished career ends with this campaign. He didn't really accomplish much in Italy from 544 to 548 or 549. Before he left, though, he would see to it that Rome was refortified and resupplied. Belisarius had spent his military career expanding Roman borders in the west and defending them in the east. But when he retired from Italy, the empire's control over his conquered territories was waning. Procopius writes, quote, "At about this point in the war, the barbarians became unquestionably masters of the whole West," unquote. The Ostrogoths controlled almost all of Italy, but that wasn't all. The people on the empire's borders were applying their own pressure. In the north, the Franks began asserting themselves as a major power in the region. Representatives from the other barbarian kingdoms were now regularly arriving in Constantinople to demand payouts from the emperor. And along the Danube, the Balkans were, quote, "being ravaged and destroyed in a pitiable manner," unquote. This really seemed like a new era. No more Theodora, no more Belisarius, renewed barbarian strength. In 540, this would have seemed unimaginable. But this wasn't the end of the Gothic War. Totila wanted to finish off the Romans. He had most of Italy, but he had lost his jewel, the Eternal City. He wanted it back. And he would stop at nothing to make that happen.